Welcome to What Shall We Say to These Things?
And I'm Jay.
And I'm TJ, and this is your low-key ghetto Bible study. So if you have not checked out our first episode, which is our intro, where we gave context for this whole shindig, where we gave reasons why we're doing it, we invite you to check that out first. Gives a bit of a background as to why we're doing this, and we share what we will be getting into from this episode.
Right. And so, last time we said Esther was a story we were familiar with, something we thought was relevant, and so that's what we're going to be starting. But instead of starting by reading the book, we wanted to start with some background. Look at the context of the story, I guess historically.
Yeah, and give us an idea of, the setting,
right?
Our characters. Well, not necessarily. We're not going to get too much into characters.
Oh, right. No, not in this episode.
Yeah, but we just set the scene.
Right. Exactly. Right. So we did a little bit of reading on that. And if we've been completely honest, we ended up more confused than we were to begin with.
But before we get into that, can you tell me about your history, your personal history with the story of Esther? Like, what are your first memories with this particular story?
Okay, so my memory isn't very great right now, but to me, my earliest, I guess, account of the story would be the VeggieTales version. Yeah, so she gets picked up in a van and she goes to the palace and she wins the talent show and then she becomes queen. That's the version I'm most familiar with. And then I think I must have read the story, realized, okay, VeggieTales didn't give us the whole story, but it never really, I don't think I've ever paid as much attention to it as when we did it at church. Yeah.
Okay. We were talking about this last night, and I was sharing that my first memory of the story was from the Bible story sets we had as children. I think it was a series of. She's pointing at the books right now. I don't even think it was necessarily those. I think it was the red ones. Those are the blue ones. I think it was the red ones. Because I think this one actually is the Bible. So I don't even know if these have the story of Esther. We can always check later.
It should. It's the whole Bible.
Okay.
So up until Revelation.
We'll check it out.
Yeah.
But in that book, there was this the images. To me, my memory of the story had more to do with the pictures in the book than the actual words, and so we see the line of young women entering the palace, and Mordecai is sitting outside, and then you get the impression that the same way they were lined up, walking into the palace, is how they passed in front of the king.
Okay.
And that was my view, my idea of the story of Esther, and even continuing to read it as I grew up from the Bible itself, I don't think
you ever processed.
I don't think I ever processed a lot of what actually the Bible is saying that happened until a couple of years ago, maybe like 2-3 years ago. Dr. David Williams, who is like this brilliant man, was doing a presentation at a church, and my father is one of his legit fans. Well, maybe fan is not necessarily the right word, but my father believes in Dr. Williams. And so usually when he's in St. Lucia, where he goes, that's where our father goes. And so I went with him, and he did a presentation on the story of Esther that completely blew my mind. And hopefully, as we go through the actual study of the book, we're going to share some of what I picked up from his presentation and what MJ has learned from her personal study, and we'll go through it together. Now, let's get into the backdrop for itself.
Okay. So, in the first chapter, we find out where the story is taking place.
Yeah.
It's in most of the story happens in Susa, which is the palace city of the Persian Empire.
So where can we find Persia today?
And modern Persia would be Iran.
Okay. And it's interesting because I don't think before that I had ever processed, wait, these people are identified as Jews, but here they are in Persia. Like how yeah.
Okay.
What is the connection? And I think it's only listening to Dr. Williams and the research we did for our own presentation, was I able to piece together the timeline. And even like MJ was saying at the beginning of this recording, that in our research we ended up a lot more confused than when we started, because it looks like historians,
there are lots of people where we assume they might be separate people, with the same name, or either they didn't clarify who was who, like the first, the second, the 3rd, or they mixed up the chronology and just like put any order, like the records are not documented in chronological order.
Okay.
So we're not sure about everything, but based on, if you looked at Daniel, you could grasp the timeline for why the Jews would be outside of Israel. You see Nebuchadnezzar come in and destroy Jerusalem and take captives back to Babylon, and that's how Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego end up in Babylon. And then we follow through Daniel and we see the Medes and Persians take over Babylon, and we have King Cyrus taking over from Belteshazzar, who is Nebuchadnezzar's son.
Yeah.
And so,
not to cut you off, but I feel like that's an interesting part of history, because we were just talking about it with the handwriting on the wall, and I feel like it happened in such like quick succession, where the very same night he learns that his kingdom will be taken from him and given to another, they legit come in and conquer, and it was like a now for now message. And I don't know if like there's any other part in the Bible where we see that kind of swift action, where somebody gets a message today and we see it come to fruition in that very same day. So that just stood out to me.
Okay. Yeah. And then right. So Cyrus takes over, and so that's where we end up having the Persian Empire coming to rule, and it's the same empire. I think he says so in Esther. I say he. I'm not sure who wrote it.
Yeah.
That the Persian Empire stretched from India all the way to Ethiopia. So you have the Persians taking over, and so it becomes this is the same empire that had taken over Israel.
But I think they actually, well, in our very confusing research, I think they were saying that he had already added some.
Well, the Babylonians had already had some. That's what you're saying. They had Israel. They had other places.
And then the Persians themselves, the Medes and the Persians themselves, they conquered
other places.
Right. So it was an even larger extent.
Okay.
So they conquered Babylon and took over what Babylon had, but they were like, okay, I want more. We're gonna add on some more to our providence.
Right. And so there's this huge empire with almost 130 provinces. So you could imagine that there would be lots of different groups of people, different ethnicities, different religions, and it just so happens that the Jews are one of these groups. And so that's how we can place Esther and Mordecai in Persia at that time.
Yeah.
Right. They're Jews in Persia because of that. And I guess we also want to look at what that would mean. why were they there?
Why were they still there?
Why were they still there?
Yeah.
Because in our research, we found out that Cyrus, early on, I think it's early on in his reign, but at some point in his reign, Cyrus lets them go. There had been prophecies before that God would let his people go and they would be able to return to Zion, and Cyrus fulfills that prophecy with his decree. He tells them, I want y'all to go build the temple to your God and worship it. So he tells them anybody who wants to go can go, and a lot of them do. About 40,000 of them pick up from all of the different tribes. They take their servants with them, and Cyrus gave them instructions. Those who were not going to go, that they should fund
those who are going.
Those who are
okay.
going. Yeah.
And I think I kind of want to credit Daniel for that, because I feel like interacting with Daniel, as one of his wise men, would have given him a level of respect for the Jewish people. Yeah. I think, because I don't know if it's in specific words, but I feel like we get the impression, looking at Daniel's life, that all of the leaders that he worked with had him in high esteem.
Right. Yeah. And he kept being promoted.
Yes.
So he had to be doing something right. Yeah. So we have Cyrus sending people home, but yet at this point, during Xerxes' reign, this is after Cyrus's reign, we still have Jews living there,
in Persia.
Living in Persia. We were reading through Ezra, and we found that there's another Persian king who encourages them to go home, but we're not sure if that's before or after Esther's time. We were not able to figure that out.
Yeah, it's just chaos. But I think it's easy for us to say they should have gone back if we don't take into consideration the fact that they were probably born there. Like, we're talking about maybe 70 years
later
down the line.
Like, they have no concept of what Jerusalem is.
And not even just what Jerusalem is. The fact is that what their parents or grandparents would have told them Jerusalem was is no longer what it is.
Right, it's in ruins.
Yeah, and so they would have to go back, and it would be a rebuilding process. And why would I leave the land I was born into, this place where I'm comfortable, I possibly have a job, I have a home.
And Esther and Mordecai are living in the palace city.
Yes.
So the capital, essentially.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be ordinary life.
Yeah. And so I think we have the fact that this is where they were born. This is probably all they knew as home.
Mm-hmm.
Going back meant work, hard labor, having to live in
the opposite of luxury.
Yeah, conditions where it would have been a struggle. And when I take all of these things into consideration, I understand. Like, I personally understand. And so, let me give you all a personal backstory. I was born in one Caribbean island. And then we moved to another Caribbean island. And in this second Caribbean island is where I spent all of my primary school life. I even started secondary school. And this is where all my friends were. This is where I was the most comfortable, because I had left the island that I was born in at about 4. So I didn't have that many. I mean, I'm a very loyal, very proud of being a citizen of that island. However, where I spent the longest time was this second island.
That's where you got baptized.
That's why I got baptized, and to this date, that is still where both of my best friends are, because this is where I spent the chunk of my childhood. However, both of my parents are nationals of another island. So not the island I was born in, not the island that I spent the majority of my childhood. They're both nationals of a third island. And just as I was starting secondary school, they decided, we're going back home. We've had enough here. And I'm like, what do you mean home? Like, this is my home.
Okay.
Alright? And I've only been to their home island on visits, like very short visits, maybe a week max at a time. I don't have friends there. I have to go and start a new school. I have to be uncomfortable for who knows how long. What you mean we going home? Like, I am at home, and so I can resonate on a spiritual level with the Jews who decided to stay. Like, I mean, I'm not saying they were right, because, like, in, where was it? Zechariah, we see a direct command from God to get out of Babylon. And so I feel like, yes, they may have been wrong for, like, directly disobeying God's command, but I understand. Like, I legit understand. Like, when you're comfortable, when you have community, when you have friends, when this is what you know, you don't necessarily want to get up and go to where your parents consider home or your grandparents consider home, because that's not what you know. You know, and it's not only is it leaving everything you've known behind, but it's a level of discomfort and struggle that
and unfamiliar,
yeah,
and uncomfortable,
that you're not necessarily ready to sign up for. So I understand, like 100%. Yeah. So that is there anything else you want to add, MJ?
No.
Okay.
I think that's where we're starting off our story. This is the context. We have Jews living in Persia, and yeah, it's a really big empire. I don't think there's anything else we need to see to give context to the rest of the story.
This story, okay. Alright. So, for the next week, we want to invite you to read Esther chapter 1. Choose a version of the Bible you're comfortable with, that makes sense to you. I know there are some versions that people are like, no, that's not actually the Bible. It doesn't matter. Whatever makes sense and is comfortable to you, you read that. I personally would recommend reading it from multiple versions.
Yeah.
Since we're reading it for an entire week, you could split it up and read multiple versions over the course of the week. And what we want you to do is 3 things.
Right. The first thing we're going to be doing ourselves is to just look at things that jump out to us. What are our first thoughts on the chapter? Is there anything that we never noticed before and we're noticing for the first time, something we're being reminded of? We just want you to record what your first thoughts on the chapter.
And then the second thing we want you to look at is there anything in the passage, in the chapter, that is telling you something specifically about who God is? So the second thing you're looking out for is, what does this chapter, or if you're doing it in smaller sections on a daily basis, what is this passage telling you about who God is?
And the last thing, we like TJ was saying in the last episode, we want our Bible study to be transformative. We want it to involve some reflection and introspection. So the last one is, what does this passage or this chapter teach me about how I should live my life? That's the question we want you to answer and think about over the week as you read the chapter.
Yep. And like we said last week, we are going to leave the comments open, and we're going to welcome you and invite you to drop your comments, share with us the things that jump out at you, what it tells you about God, what are the things it tells you about how you should live your life. And as we move forward, we're going to be sharing the comments, that some of them that we find interesting, those that resonate with us. So make sure you leave those comments so that we can share them with everybody else. And I think that's a wrap for our second episode.
Yep. Yes.
See you guys next time.
Yeah.